Today I'd like to walk you through how I do watercolored stamped images. One of the tips I use is to heat emboss my image before I watercolor. So here you can see I'm using a coffee theme, and I'm just inking it up with my Versamark ink inside of my stamp positioning tool, and that's going to come up later when I make a mistake and you'll see how easy it is to fix. So I'm just adding my embossing powder, and then I'll take it off screen and heat it up and set that embossing. And here we are with that mistake. Some of my powder didn't set properly, so I can just restamp it with my positioning tool in the exact same position, reheat it, redo it so that that error is fixed. And when I get back from doing that, I will have an additional detail that I'm adding to this stamp set. So just adding layers and layers with the embossing so that I have spaces on my project to watercolor, and that embossing powder will create barriers so that the water can't bleed out into other areas. And so then I'm ready to watercolor, and I'm going to start with the outside edge of this project, and I'm just going to do a wet on wet technique, which is my favorite technique, and I'm adding water to the outside of this image, and again that embossing line helps contain the water so that I don't make mistakes with my watercolor bleeding into other areas. So I'm just wetting the whole background paper, and I'm just going to drop some color into this background just to add some texture and dimension. So I've just chosen three colors to do this background, yellow and blue, and then when they mix you get green, so I added in some green. And I like to keep my color palette kind of simple because it's easier for me to kind of keep things under control and not end up with too many colors mixing and bleeding and then ending up with a muddy brown color. So once I finished the background, I dried it with my heat tool so that that would be completely done. And then I'm coming in and working on the lid of the cup, and it's the exact same method as the background. I'm getting the area wet first with water, and then I'm coming in and dropping in a layer of color. And I'm starting with a black mixed with a little bit of blue and adding a very, very light layer. We're going to build up layers as we go. So just add a very light layer for this first run. I'm keeping all of my color to the outside edges, so not only the outside edges of my image itself, but also the outside edges of little rims and lips in there. And if you happen to get too much color in there, don't worry about it. You can just dab it up while it's still wet and then keep working. And so I'm coming in with my next layer of dark color and just kind of going over where I put light colors to begin with. And again, I'm concentrating on the outside edges of things, both those little lips there in the front and also the outside edges of the rim. And then I'm adding darker color where shadows would be, so underneath things, so underneath the lip of the cup. And then I'm going to come in and add a darker layer inside of that rim of the cup where it would indent down. Because watercolor dries back, which means it lightens up as it dries, I added yet another layer, so we've got 3 total layers. And here I am finishing up details, so I added darker color to the ridges and a little bit darker color to the edges. And then I'm moving on to the next portion of the image, which is the cup itself. And I'm using a blue, and as I start out here, I've added too much blue, so you'll see me in a second come in here and kind of soak up some of that color. So I'm just using a wet paintbrush to pick up excess pigment and dab it off on my towel. And when you use blue on top of a white image, it actually adds a depth to the shading, which reads as white to the eye. So you can take a white cup and add a little bit of blue to it and separate it out from the pure white of the paper. So you still get the sense of having whiteness without it being very matching. So I'm just going to keep working on this image top and bottom in exactly the same way that I've done with the rest of the image, adding color here and there as we go. When I get to this center label here, I use the same yellow that I used for the background color, and I've just mixed it in with a little bit of red that was already on my palette to kind of tone it down a little bit because I didn't want the yellow to really exactly match the background color. Now in the bottom corner here of the video you can see me mixing up some color, and what I did there was I used the same blue, green, and yellow for my background, and then I'm adding in a bit of red because when you get all of your primaries in there you're going to end up with brown, and so I wanted to come up with a brown that was going to match with the background colors because it has all those same hues in there but not be really deep and dark. So I'm adding a lot of water to that color as we go, and I'm going to use that to color in the paper liner of the cup. And here again you see me, I put down too much color and I just dabbed it up while it's still wet so that I can keep working. And with the same thing with the lid is that I'm just concentrating the color toward the edges of things because that's where the deepest shadows would be. And while everything is still wet, I come in and I just dab solid color onto the edges there, and I let the water do the work for me. It'll draw the color into the image and create a feathered, shadowy effect that's hard to do just on your own. And if you let the water do the work for you, you can get that accomplished. For this final piece of the label, I'm going to get it wet just like I did with everything else, and then I'm using the greens that I used in the background because I want some contrast of color between that rectangle label with the star, the paper liner on the cup, and then this round circular label. So using the colors from the background in different ways helps divide the regions of the image, and we can do that with color. My watercolor paper started out as 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and I do this often so that when I mount my paper onto my card, I automatically have a border to work with, and my composition on my watercolor paper is right where I want it to be from the start. So I just finished this card up with a dark colored cardstock, and I will write inside of it with a white colored gel pen. That's it for today's project. I hope you give this heat embossing and watercolor technique a try.